Hi, and welcome to our training on Child Protective Services and Protection and Prevention Services within Fairfax County. We're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about Child Protective Services and how your role as an FCPS social worker will help ensure that children remain safe within our county. You are the CPS liaison for your school. Part of that role will be supporting your school and your staff with education, with learning and making sure that everybody knows what the mandated reporting policies are, but also that they're comfortable in knowing what do they do if they have a concern about a child and how can they go ahead to ensure that that concern is reported. So we're going to go over today the regulations within Fairfax County and the state. We're also going to talk a little bit about behavioral indicators and physical indicators of possible child abuse. And then we'll also talk about how you can report that and what is the protocol for the schools for reporting that and documenting those phone calls that you made. Finally, we'll spend the last few minutes talking about the protection and prevention services that are available within our county to help support families. So what is child abuse and neglect? The state of Virginia actually defines that a child who is abused and neglected needs to be under the age of 18. And it also needs to be something that is either an act of omission or commission. In other words, it's something that is done to a child or something that should have been done but is not done to a child by somebody who is either the parent or a caretaker. So that is an important part of the definition, that it needs to be someone in that parental role, that caretaking role. You can see here some different examples. It could be somebody who causes or threatens to cause a non-accidental injury or mental injury. Neglect is not providing adequate food, clothing, shelter. And you can see the other examples there. We'll go into this a little bit more in a few minutes, but there you have just kind of what the Code of Virginia states. So when we're looking at physical abuse often is something that you're able to see. It could be bruises, it could be other types of injuries. Oftentimes in the schools, it may be an unexplained injury or an injury that doesn't make sense. A student may have a bruise on their face and a teacher asks what happened and a student tells a story, or an explanation, and it just doesn't make any sense at all for that type of injury. So, in that sense, it may raise a red flag. It could be a student who has multiple injuries, who often has injuries. Sometimes it's a student who has injuries that are in various stages of healing. And if that's the case, we want to maybe take a look and see, those are red flags. Is there anything else going on? And so we're going to look at some of the behavioral indicators. Is there anything that is showing us that this child is nervous or afraid to go home? Is the child complaining that something hurts? Is the child wearing long sleeves and it's very hot out, for example? These are just examples. Just because you have one of these physical indicators or a behavioral indicator, that does not mean that that child has been abused. But it may be that those are some red flags, and we're going to have to really either take a look at things or try to clarify what's going on. When we're looking at physical abuse also, there's not always an intent to it. So in Virginia, for example, a parent can spank their child. There isn't a law saying a parent cannot do that. But what the parent's not able to do is to leave an injury. And so that's where you have that intended or not intended. A parent who spanks a child may not be wanting to injure their child, but if that happens in the process of doing so, then that would be an act of commission. That is something that a parent has done to a child, which left that injury. So next we have physical neglect. Physical neglect is when a child is not receiving something that they need for their own personal safety, for their well-being. Could be food, it could be supervision. That's a big one that we often will see. A parent going to work and having a 5 or 6 year old home by themselves. So it may be medical care, a child who has a medical condition or a mental health condition, and that parent is not following through with taking them or getting that appropriate health care. Behavioral indicators, oftentimes it's just a child simply stating, that they go home by themselves and let themselves in. Or it's a child who doesn't have the appropriate food, or is complaining that they're hungry, or is complaining that they're up all night because the parents took them out somewhere and they weren't able to sleep, or it's that type of thing that happens on a regular basis. It's very important for us that there is a difference between a family who is struggling and having difficulties with putting food on the table, with putting a roof over their heads. That's very different than a parent who is not wanting to follow through with the resources that you're giving them. A parent reaching out to you for food at a food bank and following up and getting the food, that is very different than a parent who continuously isn't showing up for their appointments to pick up the food, and the parent who is using the money that they have for food to purchase something that's not appropriate and not food. So there is a difference, and we want to make sure that we are providing that support to families. We're giving them the resources that they need, the phone numbers, the help. And if then there is a concern that they're not following through, that may be the time that you might consider calling it in, and there might be a larger concern. So sexual abuse, oftentimes in the school, the way that that's going to come out is a student actually reporting that something may have happened to them. Typically the physical indicators isn't something that we would really notice. But we do have some behavioral indicators that we certainly can keep an eye on, and that may raise red flags. Again, you have a child who's reporting abuse, but maybe you have a child who has highly sexualized play, a child that has knowledge of something that chronologically doesn't seem to make sense, chronic runaways, a child who is very fearful of going home. So there's a lot of different things that we can look at. Again, that alone, these behavioral indicators alone does not mean that a child's been sexually abused, but they are red flags, so it would be important. I had a situation once, and it was a child, and there was some sexualized play. There was definitely some inappropriate talk for that child's developmental and chronological age. And in the end, what it turned out was that the families were sharing a bedroom for sleeping, and they thought the child was asleep, and the parents were watching a rated R movie, and that child was watching it also. So again, you may see those red flags. It's not necessarily an indicator that there's been sexual abuse, but it certainly is an indicator that we want to follow up and see if we can support that child in what is happening and see what's going on. And in this situation, for example, the parents became aware that they need to be more careful at home when they are watching TV. So emotional maltreatment, this is one of the more difficult ones for Child Protective Services. They oftentimes won't take a case of that emotional maltreatment unless there is an actual impact to there. So is it causing something, a mental health condition, other types of behavioral concerns with the child? But it's definitely one that we want to keep an eye out. You can see here some of the physical indicators, behavioral indicators. And again, this is something that we definitely, when we have a child that is having some behavioral problems at school, we certainly want to keep an eye out and look into and see if there might be something else going on. So what do we do if a child discloses abuse? We talked a little bit about the different signs, some behavioral indicators, but a lot of times it actually is a child just telling us that something has happened. So when a child does disclose abuse and neglect to you, I think one of the most important things is that you stay calm. They're going to model their behavior on how you're reacting. So it's very important for you that you stay calm and that you reassure the child that they're safe and that, that you're there for them. I think that you need to remember that it says here, the safety and well-being of the child comes before any other person. And this is something that it may be very difficult for you. It may be hard for you to hear. It also may be a parent or somebody that you know, and it is something that might be hard to hear. But again, that child's safety has to come first and foremost. One of the most important things that we need to remember, and you're going to find yourself also reminding teachers, is that it is not our job to investigate. It actually isn't even our job to find out for sure that abuse happened. Remember that the abuse is actually if we suspect that that child may be abused or neglected, we need to call Child Protective Services, and it's their job to investigate. If we ask too many questions, if we ask an inappropriate question that might be leading, we could really impact that investigation that CPS is doing and possibly even the police. So it is extremely important that we don't do that. We want to listen to what the child has to tell us, but we don't want to ask those follow-up questions. There are times that you call CPS and they may need you to clarify something. Remember, there's certain criteria that they need to meet in order for it to be considered child abuse and neglect in the state of Virginia. So they need to know, did this happen when the child's younger than 18? Did it happen in Fairfax County? Did it happen, or where else did it happen? So we're going to talk in a few minutes about how CPS will make the decision on accepting a case, but there could be some information that they will have you go back and ask the student, but it's important that you don't do that until they ask you to do so. Don't take any pictures or look for injuries under clothing. If a student says they have an injury on their thigh, we would never ask that student to show us that injury. There are times that CPS may ask you, have you seen the injury? What does it look like? We've even had some times where they've asked, can you look? And the answer needs to be no, we cannot. We cannot look under clothing. If it's on their arm, if it's in plain sight, and a child says, I have a bruise on my arm, and you ask them, can I see it? They can certainly, lift up their arm and show that to you. But we cannot take pictures or look for the injuries under the clothing. When we're calling CPS, when we're reporting what that child told us. We can't make inferences. We can't guess what they mean. We can't assume. It's specifically what they told us. One of the most important things as well is that we are not to call the parent or the guardian once we have a disclosure. We need to call CPS. CPS will make that decision when it's time to call the parent. There are a lot of times that if that parent is called first, that could absolutely impact the investigation. And they can reach out to the child. They could possibly even tell the child what to say when that child's interviewed. So we want CPS to be able to make that decision on when it's time to let the parents know, if they want to let the mother know first or the father know first, for example, if they want to interview the student and come out to the school before that parent knows. So again, your first phone call is going to be to CPS, not to a parent, and do not notify parents that you've made that report. We're going to let CPS do that. And then lastly, the most important thing is that you follow the FCPS procedures for reporting, and we're going to go through those in a few minutes. So who must report? I know you all know that you're mandated reporters. Actually, every single employee of FCPS is a mandated reporter. So anybody in your school buildings, that's going all the way from the person in the bus driving the student to school, all the way through to the end of the day, every single FCPS employee is a mandated reporter. So Virginia law requires that school employees all report cases of suspected child abuse and neglect. regardless of the suspected abuser's or neglected relationship to the child. And you should report any case of suspected child abuse where the victim was under 18, even if it occurred in the past. So what that means is that if a child discloses that when they were 15, that they were abused by a certain person, you are going to need to report that because they were under 18 at the time. Again, Child Protective Services can make the decision whether they accept that case or not, but that important thing is that you are reporting it. And again, it's not up to you to decide whether that person is a caretaker, whether they aren't, do they meet that definition. Again, Virginia law requires that regardless of the relationship to the child, you're going to be reporting it. And there are times that you will possibly hear something and it is not a caretaker. That's CPS's decision on what to do with that case. And typically in those cases, if it's something that meets the criteria that should be investigated, they will then just forward that to the police to look into if it is a non-custodial or non-caretaker in them. So when should you report? So you need to report within 24 hours of learning the information of suspected abuse or neglect. So that means that that phone call to CPS needs to be completed within that 24-hour period. It is really important that you make that call as early in the day as possible. So if you learn something at 9 a.m., don't wait until 4 p.m. to call. It may be that CPS would like to come out and interview that child during the school day before they go home. And we want to make sure that child's safe. We don't want to put the child on the bus, have them go home, and have to wait to the next day for CPS to respond. So report as early as possible. That does not mean if you get a phone call, if you get a report, a teacher comes to you at 4 p.m. with a suspected case of abuse, that you hold on to that till the next morning so you can report in the morning. But what it means is if you have information, move forward sooner than later so it's earlier in the day. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how CPS responds and how quickly they respond, but there are times that they do have an immediate response, so we want to make sure to give them as much time as possible. The law requires you to make the report if you suspect child abuse and neglect. I've mentioned this before, it's not your job to investigate, and it's not your job to know for sure whether or not it happened. If you're suspecting that it may have happened or something may be happening, you are required to call. So if you're unsure, you want to err on the side of safety for the child. If you're even kind of debating it back and forth in your head, that means there has to be something that's causing you to suspect, and therefore we will want to call. Again, CPS may not take the case. They may rule it out, but you at least completed your end of it and you went ahead and made that call. So when you do call CPS, what type of information do you need to share? What is it that they want to know? Well, some of it's just going to be simple demographic information. They're going to want to know names, addresses, phone numbers of parents, of all the children in the home, birth dates. Do you know if anyone else lives in the home? A lot of this information you're going to be able to get off of SIS, off of our information that we have within our schools. So you'll just need to have that ready to be able to share. They're also going to want as much information as you can give on the suspected abuser. It may be a parent in the home, but it could be somebody else. It may be that you do not have anything other than a name. You still need to call. That's not a reason to not call and report. It may be that CPS, if they accept the case, are going to have to look for more information on that suspected abuser on their end. But the important thing is that you share as much information on that suspected abuser and the relationship as possible. They're going to want to know about what happened. What is it that you know about the abuse or neglect? They're going to want to know, is there anything else that they should know regarding the family? Special needs of a child. CPS may take a look at a call differently if a child has special needs versus if it's a child that is developmentally doing well and are able to better share or process. If a child, for example, is unable to communicate and there is a concern, it may be more likely to accept the case than a child who is able to talk and able to say that nothing's going on. So if there is some type of disability, if there is special language needs, anything else that needs to be shared in order for them to make that appropriate decision. So when you call, they're going to ask for your name and your information, a follow-up number, what school you're at, things like that. And it is important that you can share that information. If they accept the case, the CPS worker is going to reach out to you and, well, it's very likely they'll reach out to you and ask you again about the information that you have and any other questions. They'll also sometimes will reach out just to ensure, is a child there that day, because they're on their way out to talk to the child. So, you know, a lot of people, when they call CPS, get a little nervous about sharing information and is this going to come back, but actually your name and address and information on that you called it in is confidential. So that is something that they are not allowed to share with the family. And it is an important part of allowing CPS to follow up with you. It also is important because it is documentation that you fulfilled your duty and that you did call the case into CPS. So record keeping requirements. So all records pertaining to reports and investigations going to CPS are required to be kept at the school until the child turns 20. So it's not something that follows the child from school to school. So if, let's say, a second grader is at their elementary school and a phone call is made to CPS, there is going to be documentation of that phone call at the school, and it's going to remain at that elementary school. It does not go in the cumulative file with the student. It does not follow them to middle school and to high school. It's going to stay at that elementary school. Each school has a separate file, a separate drawer. It may look differently, but a separate place where all documentation is kept. And it is up to that principal and that school to be keeping an eye on things, and it's going to be purged when that child reaches the age of 20. So records are for the principal's documentation, and again, it should not be transferred to the school. It stays with the school, stays with the principal. It's probably a little hard to see specifically what it looks like here, but there is a form with FCPS. It's form SE 279. This is a form. It is uploaded. It's on Blackboard as well as the Google Classroom for new workers, and it is the form that we use in FCPS to document our phone calls to Child Protective Services. We use this form every time. It is not just if a case is accepted for investigation. So that form is going to be filled out. The form is going to be filled out. You're going to be able to put the information on the family. You're going to put a little information about what the concern is, and you are going to take that to your school, in the office, to the principal, wherever it is that the file is, and file it away in there, and it will stay there until the child turns 20. So FCPS reporting procedures, there's a couple different ways this can happen, and if you think about it, it makes sense to have a few different streams. It could be anybody that's making this report. Oftentimes it may be you. It may be a teacher, a cafeteria worker, office staff. They have a concern, they reach out to you, and you have this information. But because all of those people are mandated reporters, they're able to just pick up the phone and make that call. There's also some principals that maybe the office worker will go to that principal or the assistant principal, and they'll make the call. So there's definitely different routes that it can go, but the CPS report, it's two main ways that it's made. So the report can be made directly by that staff member, like I mentioned, and they call CPS themselves. But that's not the end of it. From there, they need to alert their school that they made this call. There needs to be follow-up. So they would then notify the principal, and they would ensure that also you are notified. Again, you are the liaison for CPS, so we would want to make sure that you know about this as well. The other route is that the staff member can let the principal know, and then they maybe can make the report jointly with the principal, or oftentimes they may loop you into it at that point. So again, if you see this both ways, the principal does end up finding out about this report that's being made, and you will be filling out that form that I just talked about. Time frame to report, as I've mentioned, I just want to repeat, is within 24 hours of having a suspicion. You see the phone numbers right there, the 703-324-7400. There is a state after hours number. The hotline for Fairfax is only manned during the day up until, I believe it's 4:30. But at that point, the calls will automatically roll over to the state hotline. So you don't need to know this other state number. It's not a bad thing to have if there ever were to be a phone problem with the county hotline, and you could call directly, but it's really that 324-7400 should be the only thing that you need to know. So again, these are the reporting procedures, and we're going to take a look at this, and these are just different ways that you can get there. You see that everything, no matter how our FCPS is going to notify Child Protective Services, it all ends with that form that I've talked to you about, that SSSE 279. So it may start out with you calling CPS directly, or let's say I'll start with the top one with the worker. It could be a second grade teacher. They're concerned about something. They will call CPS directly. So then the next step is notify the principal, and the principal or that worker or somebody will then notify the social worker. It may start out with the principal is getting notified first, then there's the call to CPS and notifying the social worker. Or oftentimes what tends to happen is the social worker is notified, then calling CPS, and then letting the principal know. So either way, each school has kind of a different way that they may want to do things. Any of these three are fine. The most important thing is that the call is made, but there are some schools that they have their specific protocols, their preferences on which way they would like to see it. So when you do go to your school and you're there, it's important to have that conversation with the principal and talk with your counselors and the rest of your mental health team, your clinical team, and make sure that you're all on the same page for how this is going to happen. And again, regardless of the way, the CPS must be notified within 24 hours, and you must finish with that SSSE 279 and make sure that is on file. So when you do call CPS, I talked before about establishing a valid complaint. What cases, what are they going to accept for an investigation or for an intervention? So there's 4 criteria that has to be met within Fairfax County for them to accept the case. The first one I've talked about, and that is that the child was under 18 years old at the time of the abuse. The second one I've already mentioned as well is that the alleged abuser is a parent or someone in a caretaking role. They are also going to look at whether or not the abuse took place in Fairfax County. If the abuse took place in Prince William County, that would be a phone call to Prince William CPS. If it took place in a different state, you would have to call that different state. So depending on where it took place, depends on which CPS has jurisdiction over the matter. So they're going to look and see whether the abuse took place in Fairfax County. And then lastly, they're going to look to see, does the alleged abuse, do the circumstances meet the definition of abuse and neglect? So the hotline screener, or the person that's going to basically answer the phone when you call, what is their job? They're going to listen to everything you have to say, and they need to establish the validity of that call that you make. They're going to listen, they're going to write down and get all the information, the demographic information, but more importantly, hear about what are the concerns, what are the, whether it's the red flags or what are the statements that a child has made, and they're going to deem whether it meets that criteria, looking at those 4 criteria that we just talked about on the previous slide. If it does, and some of them are very straightforward, they're going to accept it immediately for CPS to take over. They're going to assign it then a priority. They have their priority 1s, 2s, and 3s, and really that depends on how quickly they're mandated to respond. So something that is serious, that is happening in the home, that is currently happening, is going to possibly be a priority 1, versus something that happened 3 years ago. The alleged abuser is no longer in the child's life. The child is at no risk by going home. That may be deemed a priority 3 because it's safe for them to wait 5 days in order to respond. So again, they're taking a look at the safety of the child at the time that you're calling in, and then they're going to establish how quickly their response time will be. There are times that it's not clear whether or not they're going to be able to take the case. And that might happen when there's a lot of red flags, but we're just not 100% sure whether it is enough for them to look into, or possibly they're not sure whether it meets those 4 areas, the criteria they're looking at. So they're going to refer the case to something that they call the RED team. You see, RED stands for review, evaluate, and direct. The RED team will do 2 things. The RED team they meet on a regular daily basis, and they're going to go over all the concerns. They're going to see whether or not they feel that this should be something that is looked into, or whether or not there's some follow-up questions or information they need in order to make that decision. And also, just as important, the RED team can also come up with, okay, we're not going to accept it for an investigation or for an intervention at this time, but do we have any ideas of resources or support or directions that we can give that caller of what they can do with their concerns? Is there someone else that might be able to help them? So it may be that when you call CPS, you're not going to get an answer on if they're accepting the case until the next day once it goes through RED team. At that point, they should contact you once again and let you know the results. If you don't hear from the RED team, it's important that you can follow up. You can call CPS back again and ask them what was the outcome of their meeting. If the referral isn't valid, if they choose to not accept the case, they will go ahead and they will keep that referral on file. And that's important in case you call back again. Sometimes you need to establish that pattern of multiple phone calls. Sometimes you may call back again with additional information, or someone else in the community may call. And so it may be 3 separate calls with 3 separate pieces of information, but when you put them all together, that's enough for them to accept the case. So it is very important when you call and when they don't accept the case to know that it is still going to be kept on file. In addition, there are some other programs that the family can be screened for. The FINS, the Family Need Services, which we're going to talk about later in this presentation. There have been times that we've had workers call into the hotline and they've called in for some guidance, some, asking questions, which is a wonderful way to utilize the hotline. That is absolutely fine to do. But because they have concerns, they're calling, they're asking for guidance, but they're really not reporting, and so they have no documentation that they called. We're telling workers that if you're calling because you suspect something, even if you're just giving some information and they're not taking the case and actually documenting it, that does not count as referring to CPS. So if you are calling, if you have concerns and on their end they don't, and they either don't feel they need to document, or if you're just asking some questions and they're not documenting, it is more important that you give them the information. You give them the family name. Again, this isn't for a general question, but this is when you are calling because you do have concerns about a family. It's important that we do get that documented because, as I mentioned, well, first of all, you are then covered, that it shows that you did call in your concern. But also, just as important, sometimes it takes time and multiple calls to be able to create that complete picture of what's going on with the family. So if you call and your case is not accepted, you can also talk to the worker and ask them why, and they can let you know why. There are a lot of times that it's not a caretaker. Maybe it is a neighbor, but that neighbor was not babysitting the child at a time. Or if it was, well, sometimes it may be another child, another student. If that's the case and there wasn't a caretaker, they may be forwarding that case on to the police. And that would be important to know what the status is. So you can definitely ask them why they didn't take it. Any questions, any concerns, talk with your supervisor. There are times that CPS does not accept a case and it does reach a level of concern that you may have your supervisor calling a supervisor over there to get more information to find out why it wasn't taken. Or it may be that the information you shared wasn't all the information, and by talking it over with your supervisor, you come up with that there is a little bit more that you are able to call back and share. So any questions, any concerns, or even just for follow-up and making sure you did everything, you can always consult with your supervisor. So there's two different main types of CPS responses. They have their family assessments and they have their investigations. The majority of cases that are accepted are family assessments. In that situation, they're not looking for a finding of abuse and neglect. They're not looking to document, that there is that finding. What they're looking to do is to collaborate with the family, identify services and supports. And so they're going in there, doing an assessment, finding out what the family needs and what can we provide to them to maintain safety for this child. If you look down below, it's 2018 data, but you can see that of the 1,971 validated CPS referrals, 1,360 were family assessments. So definitely a lot more. The sexual abuse cases, they are all directly investigations. Investigations involve creating a safety plan with the family, identifying services and supports similar to the assessments, but it's going to end up with a founded or unfounded case. And CPS has 45 to 60 days to complete the assessment or investigation. And oftentimes they will work, you'll hear from them, they'll work with you before they close out the case, and they will provide resources to the family. There are times they may start a CPS case and see what other types of supports they can get for that family while that investigation or that assessment is going. So how to respond when CPS comes to your school. As I mentioned, oftentimes CPS will come out to the school to interview the child because that is a safe place that they can talk with the child without any interference from the parents, and where a child oftentimes feel more comfortable talking about what might be going on. CPS workers are told to report directly to the main office. They need to show their Fairfax County ID, and then they will say, I'm here to see such and such student. Typically at that point, the CPS worker, the office staff will reach out to the school social worker. Sometimes it may be a day you're not at your school. It could be a counselor or somebody else, or the administrator is notified of the visit. We always ask the CPS workers to leave their business card, so if you aren't there, there is someone that you can follow up with. That worker is given a confidential spot to interview the child. CPS is able to talk with any child and their siblings without consent of parents, and parents do not need to be there. So again, when they're showing up at the school to talk to the child and the parents don't know, they are able to do that, and that is per Virginia code, so they can interview a child. And I wanted to mention that and make sure that was clear, because there may be some confusion on occasion. An office staff, somebody will be worried and, oh, do we have permission from the parents? So it is important that, at the beginning of the school year, just as in we're updating staff and making sure they know about mandated reporting, it's important that especially office staff, know about this regulation and that they are able to come and interview students. So we are not able to give copy of student records to CPS without a parental consent. We're also not able to talk to CPS with any additional information other than that immediate safety information that we reported to CPS, anything that has to do with that immediate concern. A lot of times we may get follow-up questions. Can we get information regarding their behavior, their discipline record, or can we see their special ed file? Or those are things that might be important for their investigation, but they would need a consent from the parent in order for us to share it, because those are things that are not important for that immediate safety and well-being of the child. So it's very important that you know that, because oftentimes CPS will ask for that information. Again, we can absolutely share it with them, but we have to have a consent from the parents. And they're able to get that consent. It's just a matter of they're reaching out to the parents, usually is the next step anyway, and they can have that as part of their protocol to get that consent for us to share additional information with them. But please make sure you remember that, and that additional staff at the school is aware of that. It's also important that school staff and everybody knows that they're not supposed to be calling the parents and letting the parents know, hey, CPS is here right now. Again, that CPS worker will contact the parents as part of their investigation. So it may be CPS showing up, it may be CPS and the police showing up together. So they're the ones that are going to take that next step and reach out to the parents when they're ready to do so. And it's important that we don't do that prior, because we can really impact their investigation. So that's CPS in a nutshell. Moving on, there's another level through Department of Family Services of protection and prevention. So protective and prevention is there, and it really is to strengthen families and to promote child safety, and really with the idea of preventing that abuse and neglect. What can we do for families before they reach that level of child protective services intervention? What about those families we're concerned about and we call in and it really doesn't meet the definition of child abuse, but we see that there are concerns? So there are programs within our county that are able to support those families and provide case management, provide ongoing resources and meetings and somebody for these families. It could be voluntary. It also could be court ordered. It may be that, let's say, Child Protective Services just went through a family assessment and they're very concerned about this family and the needs rise to such occasion that they want to continue working with that family. Maybe the family is voluntarily doing, in agreement with that, or possibly there's some type of court order. So there's the prevention program. The referrals all go through the CPS hotline, and we're going to talk in a minute about the Family Needed Services, the FINS cases. There's also a domestic violence unit within Department of Family Services that you'll be able to learn more about at another time. So right now in our virtual world and with COVID and all the changes, the Department of Family Services have had some impact on what they are able to provide with protection and prevention. And so I'm going to continue on in this presentation on talking about what these services are, but it's important to realize that there may be some impact on what cases they're able to accept and what they're able to do at any given time. So again, it is important to talk with your supervisor about whether or not they're accepting cases at this time. And also it's a question that you can ask when you're calling in to Child Protective Services. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about FINS, because that is a service that our social workers utilize quite a lot. Again, it's a family in need of services, and they're families who have serious concerns that are identified. And it can be concerns relating to suspected child abuse and neglect, but it could also be a family going through difficult times for another reason. I've had several families with FINS cases, and it's with a child with special needs, with autism, and it was creating a lot of difficulties in the home and a lot of trauma in the home. And there was never a concern of abuse and neglect with the parents, but it was a family that needed the services and needed the extra support. And it was a very important resource for them. I had another family who had a very, very serious car accident, and due to the car accident, there were just multiplying problems leading to loss of housing and inability to work and a lot of other issues. And that was a FINS case. So I want to make sure that you all understand that FINS is not just for kids that we think have been abused, but it's for families with serious concerns identified by CPS. So it could be that there are abuse and neglect concerns, but again, it could be that there are some other concerns like I mentioned. There are some real clear-cut FINS criteria that need to be met for a family to qualify. And one of those criteria is that there has been CPS phone calls in the past, that there have been phone calls in and concerns. You know, in my situation with a family who had a car accident, it did lead to CPS concerns and a CPS phone call. And that was related more towards some concerns with the living conditions, and then the concerns the family had become homeless. And it was CPS that actually identified that this family would meet the criteria of the family in need of services. They're also going to look at the parent capacity. You know, how are they with their ability to be able to parent? You know, in this situation, the parent was not able to parent because they were seriously injured and had some very long-term chronic health conditions. In other situations, it may be a parent who is impacted due to mental illness. Maybe the parent's impacted due to, just like in the case of my family with the student with autism, just with not having the knowledge or the ability to be able to meet the needs of the child. So again, you're looking at the parent's capacity. We're also going to look at the youth in the home. You know, are there a lot of children? Is it a very needy child? Is it a child who is explosive? Is it, you know, is there another parent in the home that maybe is drinking? You know, so what are the other conditions in the home? So, but the idea is to provide that early prevention services to families to make it so you don't arrive to be able to having that CPS, you know, that abuse and neglect happening in that CPS case. So the goal is to strengthen and support the family, and also to increase the self-sufficiency and personal accountability. You can see what I wrote there. And if you can think about it, it's really providing, and it's somebody who can do some intensive work with the families to provide that knowledge and the resources for that family to then be able to sustain moving on their own. So again, there's real clear criteria. That criteria for FINS is uploaded both on Blackboard and in the New Work or Google Classroom, and you can see the different categories. And in order to meet that FINS criteria, that family would have to meet it within 2 or more of those categories, so 2 or more of those sections. So it's going to be hard for you to see here, but this is the FINS criteria, and there's multiple different sections and different criteria within each section, and it would be 2 or more of those areas that a family would have to meet in order to qualify for FINS. So that's our presentation. It really is just kind of CPS and prevention services in a nutshell. We're going to have further conversations. We're going to talk about this more, and we will continue to provide you with guidance and support. There's a lot of other prevention services within Fairfax County. There's a lot of support. There's different parent education programs. There's support through some of the other departments as well. If you go into Blackboard, you will see a lot of that information as well. So reach out to your supervisors with any questions and your mentors, and we will definitely be having additional conversations shortly on this matter. So thank you so much for joining me, and we look forward to continuing to help you support the students in your school and the families in your school to keep them safe. Thank you.